Experiment 6.1 Swallowing Reflex. The materials: a glass of water. The procedure: swallow the saliva in the mouth and immediately afterward try to swallow again. You will find it is difficult to swallow for the second time. Drink a glass of water and repeat the procedure once. You will notice that you have no difficulty to swallow in rapid succession. Question: 1. Why is it difficult to swallow our saliva in rapid succession? Is swallowing a completely voluntary action? Saliva acts as the stimuli in the mouth cavity. When the saliva has swallowed in the first time, there is no more saliva, thus no more stimuli. Besides, our body is undergo peristalsis in esophagus to move water down from the throat to our stomach. The muscle on the esophagus require a period for relaxation to allow next peristalsis to occur. Swallowing is a voluntary action and followed by involuntary action. 2. Explain the ability to swallow in rapid succession when drinking water compared to just swallowing saliva in mouth cavity. When the saliva has swallowed at the first time, there is no more saliva, so there is no more stimuli. Hence, we need to wait until our saliva gland produce enough saliva to act as the stimuli in order for the swallowing reflex to occur. However, after drinking water, we feel easier to swallow the saliva because the water acts as the stimulus to replace saliva in our mouth cavity to stimulate the muscle of the esophagus to swallow. Discussion: from the experiment 6.1, we discovered that it is hard to swallow the saliva in rapid succession. However, it is easier for us to swallow our saliva in rapid succession after drinking a glass of water. We have tried to swallow our saliva twice in rapid succession without drinking some water and find it is harder than swallowing the saliva after we have drunk a glass of water. During the experiment, we need to be careful when swallowing rapidly as we might hurt our throat during swallow. Procedure: 1. Experimenter and subject has stopwatch and the stopwatch is started simultaneously. 2. Experimenter stopped her stopwatch and the subject stopped her stopwatch as soon as she saw the experimenter's action. 3. The time lapse between the experimenter and the subject's action is recorded. 4. The experiment is repeated 10 times and the average reaction time is calculated.
Hello, Assalamualaikum. My name is Hilman. So I will be presenting about experiment 6.3. So experiment 6.3 is reaction time to touch. This experiment is about the reaction time of the subject to react when the experimenter touch them. This experiment is conducted to determine the speed of impulse transmission and to determine the time lapse between experimenter's time and subject's time. Next, to conduct the experiment, we will need some materials. First is 2 stopwatches, measuring tape, and lastly, thread. So let's move on to the methodology. First of all, both experimenter and subject should have a stopwatch each and start both watches simultaneously. The subject should close his or her eyes. Second, The experimenter presses his or her watch to stop and simultaneously touch the subject's foot. Then, the subject presses his or her stopwatch to stop. Repeat 10 times, calculate and record the average reaction time. After that, with a thread, measure as accurately as you can the length of the nerve pathway between the point where the stimulus is received, which is foot, and the part of the body response, which is finger. With the subject presses switch, assume that the signals from the foot are transmitted to the back of the top of the brain through the spinal cord and then down to the shoulder, hand, and last point is the finger. Lastly, use a ruler or measuring tape to measure the length of the thread used in procedure 5. So this is our result. Table 6.2 shows the table, the time lapse between experimenter and subject actions. So there is 10 trials and the experiment time, the subject time and the time lapse. And we have obtained the average reaction time of subject to touch, and that is 0.297 seconds. So in table 6.3, the analysis of reaction time results, we have length of nerve pathway between foot receptor to finger effector, it is 1.83 meter, and the speed of impulse transmission is 6.16 meter per second. So the discussion for this experiment is we have obtained the result on time lapse between the experimenter and the subject's action, the length of the nerve pathway between foot to finger, and the speed impulse transmission. So to calculate the speed impulse transmission, we need to divide the length of the nerve pathway between foot to finger with the average reaction time of subject to touch. Then we can calculate the average reaction time of subject to touch by repeating the experiment 10 times using stopwatch. Hence, divide the sum of the time in 10 trials and divide by 10. Next, use the measuring tape to get the length of the nerve pathway between foot to finger. With that result, we can calculate the speed impulse transmission by dividing 1.38 meter with 0.297 second. So, the speed of the impulse transmission is 6.16 meter per second. In this experiment, we need to take several precaution steps to make our results are precise and accurate. First, repeat the experiment for several times to get the precise result. Second, make sure the observer eyes are perpendicular to the measuring tape to avoid any error. Lastly, make sure that the experimenter and the subject start their stopwatch simultaneously to make sure the time lapse is logic. So now let's move on to question. I will pass to Kuliah.
Now we will discuss the question for experiment 6.3. This is the question for number 1, and the answer is the subject's reaction time to touch is more faster. The reason is touch is a monosynaptic pathway, so we may react before we are aware, while sight is a polysynaptic road, meaning that it takes time to react since signal move from the eyes to the brain, spinal cord, and then out to the muscle. The second question asks us to investigate which are spinal reflex and which are cerebral reflex. Before that, we need to know the difference between them. The cerebral reflex controlled by brain take place in head region and also involve cranial nerve, while the spinal reflex controlled by spinal cord take place in the rest of the body and involve spinal nerve. So the answer is the cerebral reflex are responsible for reaction time to sight, since the eyes are one of the organs that are directly connected to the brain, while the spinal reflex are responsible for reaction time to touch. This is because it does not require brain involvement. The last question asks the other reflex that's shown by humans and they are part of CNS. Based on the table, we can see the example of spinal reflex, which is stretch reflex, Golgi tendon reflex, withdrawal reflex, and also cross-extensor reflex. While for the cerebral reflex, we have consensual light reflex, corneal reflex, auditory reflex, and vestibulo-ocular reflex. For the conclusion, we can conclude that we will achieve the objective of the experiment, which is understanding our body's reflex. Firstly, we discovered that swallowing our saliva is fast succession, is more easier after drinking water. despite the fact that the swallowing reflex includes both intentional and involuntary activities. We were also able to measure and compute the subject's average reaction time to sight and touch, finding that the reaction time to touch is faster than the reaction time to sight. Reflex actions are involuntary, as we discovered through this experiment. Then, monosynaptic reflex are those that have only two neurons, one sensory and one motor. Last but not least, the time to react to the stimulus is short due to efficiency of nervous system in human body.